Former Microsoft executive John Wood was trekking through Nepal in 1998. He struck up a conversation with a man who was the resource manager for the schools there. He invited John to visit one of the schools with him. John not only saw a school with no resources, but a library with no books. The man told him that in Nepal, quote, "We are too poor to afford education, but until we have education, we will always be poor." That statement changed the course of John Wood's life. He went on to found an organization to build schools and libraries and support girls' education in the developing world. Room to Read has reached nearly 8 million children worldwide and built 1,600 schools and 15,000 libraries. John Wood is the author of Creating Room to Read, and he joins me in the studio. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So after you visited that school in Nepal with the empty library, you had a massive book drive and you went back with a whole bunch of books. You wrote a book called Leaving Microsoft to Change the World.
Mm-hmm.
But briefly tell us what caused you to stop your career and say, I'm going to do this full time.
I think for me it was twofold. The first thing was that it was wonderful to go back to that village a year later with 3,000 books on the back of 6 rented donkeys and literally see that just a small donation of books was the biggest thing in the history of the village. Everybody had turned out, the parents, the grandparents, the teachers, and it felt so good to realize that we had brought 450 children the opportunity for the first time in their lives to have books to read. I mean, something so basic should not be missing. But the second part of the equation for me was that it just felt like a drop in the ocean. It just felt like I had done one library and was patting myself on the back. And I challenged myself to say there's 800 million people in the world today who lack literacy. Is one library enough? Will 5 be enough? Will 10 be enough? Well, I answered that question obviously by leaving my job at Microsoft to devote myself full time, knowing that there was going to be an absolutely gargantuan task ahead.
So in those early days, what was your way of operating?
It was literally, as I said, it was a rented donkeys. We were doing book drives over the internet, mostly collecting English language books because in Nepal, they do teach English as a second language. But it was really, for the first year probably, very much of a literally mom and pop effort. My parents, living in rural Colorado, were collecting books through rummage sales, tag sales, and going to the bookstores that sold 10 used books for $1. And I was doing a book drive in Australia where I lived. And it was really just a kind of a startup mom and pop thing where my parents said, well, we value books, we value education, we'll help you out. And then it wasn't really until I quit Microsoft to devote myself full-time to it that it became a more professionally run organization that we know today as Room to Read.
You know, a lot of times very well-meaning people from wealthy countries go to the developing world and they say, oh, here's a school, here's a facility. And then they leave and it's completely run down. Nobody maintains it. Mm-hmm. How do you avoid that happening to your facilities?
A key part of what Room to Read does is what we call the challenge grant. And the idea behind it is exactly that. It's a challenge to the community to say, we don't want to do this for you. We want to do it with you. And the good news is throughout the developing world, the desire that the parents have to get their kids educated is extremely strong. And when you mentioned earlier, Mimi, 1,600 schools have been opened by Room to Read, 15,000 libraries. All of our projects have a community co-investment model where the local people are putting in sweat equity. They might be digging the foundation for the school, sawing logs to make the bookshelves, pounding nails, painting the walls.
You require that.
We require that, the local people to have skin in the game. Now, the nice thing is that even with us requiring that, we still have a line as long as my arm of villages and parents who are queuing up to say, we want this for our kids. We want our kids to have a school. We want our kids to be literate. We want our daughters to go to school alongside of our sons. So even though we require that community co-investment, we are still oversubscribed every year in terms of the number of projects we can do.
And these are mostly illiterate parents wanting this for their children.
Exactly. I mean, I've traveled in over 50 countries around the world, and what I've discovered is that parents everywhere are the same. They want their children to have a better life than they've had, and that almost always means education. As you and I know from our own backgrounds, education is the one gift that you can pass on from generation to generation to generation. And I myself am the product of an educated mother, an educated grandmother, an educated older sister who read to me. So here are 3 strong women who helped me to become who I am today. So in a certain sense, I feel like I'm just paying back the world for the good fortune I had growing up in America, growing up in a small town that had a good public school system, growing up in a village that had a community library built in 1897. I'm a product of all that. So in a certain sense, I just really got lucky in life being born where I was born. And my real concern is all those kids who have lost the lottery of life, who aren't going to get educated. What hope do they have to get out of poverty? So my goal is to help, literally, in our organization's goal is to help millions, if not one day, maybe even tens of millions of those kids.
The book we're discussing is called Creating Room to Read, A Story of Hope in the Battle for Global Literacy. John Wood is the founder and co-chair of Room to Read. You've been an incredibly successful fundraiser because in order to help all these children, you've got to have money. It's not just about good intentions.
Exactly.
How have you been able to do it so well when other organizations that are equally worthy are not?
I think one of the key things about Room to Read has always been that we're not afraid to ask for the order, right? Some organizations treat fundraising as a sturdy little side business. We don't. We're very proud to be going out and telling people, here's what $250 can do. It can put a girl in school for a year. Here's what $5,000 can do. It can set up a library in a rural village, and we'll actually tell you where that library is, and you'll know where your library is set up. So I think for a lot of the success of Room to Read is because we give people a direct causal link between what they invest and what we do. And that's even to the point now, 1,600 schools, we can open a new school block of 4 classrooms for $35,000. Well, that's not for everybody. That's a lot of money. But there are people who get together at work and say, well, I'll grab 5 coworkers. We'll get our company to match our donations. Bingo, a new school gets built. And that's really Room to Read's model. We're very grassroots. It's school by school. It's library by library. So we're not, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of billionaires behind us. We don't have celebrities behind us. It's just real people like you and me rolling up our sleeves every day and going to work. But for fundraising for us, a lot of it is basically reminding people that a little bit of money goes a long way. In the developing world, $5,000 literally is enough that if you show up with that in a rural village in Cambodia or Nepal to say, we want to help you build a library, but you have to help yourselves, people will be queuing up. And just imagine, that energy that ends up getting from the village when they say, this is our one chance to get our kids educated.
How do you decide what countries you operate in and what projects you take in those countries?
For the countries we operate in, we try to figure out how can we sail with tailwinds as opposed to sailing into really intense headwinds. So we look for measures of political stability. We look for social stability. What happens when there's an election? Is there violence? Is there not violence? We look for whether or not the Ministry of Education is doing a good job. Do they have a functioning curriculum? Do they have textbooks? And then we look for the community engagement, that if the communities are apathetic, there's really no sense in us working there. But if you have places like Vietnam where there's a very Confucian respect for education, and when we say to those communities, we want to work with you, but you're going to have to work alongside of us, what will their reaction be? We also look for donor intent because, we have to make sure that our investors are interested in that country. All other things held equal, you're probably more likely to get somebody to be interested in Cambodia or Nepal because people have traveled there than you are, maybe, let's say, a more obscure country where nobody's traveled. But I think for us, the biggest impacting factor is how committed are the local people and the local government to being part of the solution? Because as I've said, we're not going in and doing it for them. We're doing it with them.
You had decided to expand into South Africa and had a very unfortunate start to that first expansion.
We did, yes, unfortunately. I think part of what I try to do in this new book is talk not just about the victories, but talk about the things that were difficult for us. Talk about the times when we found corruption. And that just hits you in the gut level when you realize that people have been stealing money from you. And in that case, we've had
you
to
lost
go off
$30,000.
Fire employees when that happens. I mean, the key thing is to audit what we do, and if we find corruption, make sure we have a zero tolerance policy towards it and fire.
So was it the actual people that you had hired in country that were lining their pockets?
Unfortunately, that has happened. It happens all over the NGO world, and I think one of the key things is the key reasons to audit is to make sure that you can catch it really early. And in the book, I try to talk about some of the more difficult parts of creating the organization called Room to Read. So, for example, the financial crisis, all of a sudden we go from good times to bad times and everything turns around in 24 hours. And we have these humongous expansion plans in 2008, and then all of a sudden Lehman melts down and Bear Stearns goes away, and the stock market starts to drop.
And they had been some of your supporters, right?
Yeah, Lehman was actually a supporter of ours. We get a lot of support from the banking and financial industry. So one of the biggest challenges for us in the last 4 years has been to raise money in a really uncertain and in some cases collapsing global economy.
Has your organization, you talked about corruption in some places that you deal with. Have you been asked to pay a bribe I mean, just, okay, give us a little bit of money and then we'll let you work in this village?
Well, the nice thing is about our model is we've reversed that notion because we tell the governments we work with, you cannot ask us for money because we're going to be asking you for money. And that's the way we've turned things around. We say to the Ministry of Education, if we are going to build a school in villages in your country, we're going to ask you, indeed require you, to pay the teachers' salaries for those additional teachers who are on site. And if we're putting a librarian in the library, the Ministry of Education is also paying for that. The challenge grant itself for the local communities co-investing is also great because that acts as an anti-corruption device. What I mean by that is people don't steal from themselves. If you have 200 local parents who have put each 100 rupees or 200 rupees into the building fund to get that new school built, guess what? Those parents become your best police officers, watching to make sure that nothing is going wrong and that no money is disappearing. The final part of the equation for us at Room to Read is we don't go into a village and give them $30,000 worth of cash and hope a school gets built, right? That's just setting yourself up for failure. What we do is go in and we say we're going to work to get the cement on site, the bricks on site, the desks on site. So we're not doing large cash transactions. What we're doing is to say we'll come in with the building materials and then you as a community can actually work with us to build the school.
John Wood is the author of Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. He's the founder and co-chair of Room to Read. We're discussing his book called Creating Room to Read. You said that all the countries that you work in have English as a second language, and initially all those books that were being donated and filling those libraries were in English.
Yes.
But then some of the children were like, well, we want books in our own language. What did you do?
One of the things we do very often is go back and just ask for feedback from the communities and ask for feedback from the students of how are we doing, what can we improve. And in 2004, we did a survey where 52% of the children said they would use the libraries more often if they had more books in the mother tongue, more books in the language they spoke at home. Well, that sounds fairly obvious. Of course, a child in Vietnam is going to want books in the Vietnamese language. But the challenge here is that with 2 billion people living on less than $2 a day, the for-profit publishers don't have an incentive to produce books in those languages. So
because they can't afford to buy the books anyway.
Yeah, so there's no profit incentive. So if you go to talk, and we were very close to the people at Scholastic, but they would laugh when I say to them, how's your business in the Lao language? How's your business in the Khmer language or Setswana, Zulu, Xhosa, Sinhalese, or Tamil? So the challenge here is that there is no Dr. Seuss of Cambodia. There is no J.K. Rowling of Nepal. Except that there is now, because Room to Read is finding those local authors and local artists, paying them small stipends to write and illustrate really high-quality children's books. I joke that we've become the biggest publisher you've never heard of because we're publishing now in over 20 languages that are somewhat obscure, I guess, by developed world standards, but that I think if you look at the supply chain of poverty, a lot of it starts because of the fact that children don't have books in their native tongue. Therefore, they stay illiterate. They never get into a habit of reading. That leads to them dropping out of school, not being able to pay attention because they can't actually read what's written on the chalkboard or in the textbook. And so Room to Read's trying to really change that by producing really high-quality children's literature. We've published over 850 titles to date, and by the end of this year, we'll actually have produced our 1,000th original title. So what's great about that is the J.K. Rowlings and the Dr. Seuss's of these countries are now able to publish through Room to Read.
There is, you also encourage the children to write and to draw and to illustrate their books. And there was 2 teens who wrote an illustrated book called Baby Fish Goes to School. Tell us about that book.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about this. Baby Fish Goes to School is one of my favorite books. It's 2 Sri Lankan teenage girls came up with this concept, and it's all about a little baby fish who watches every day as all the animals walk to school on land and says, what is this thing called school? And they tell the baby fish about it, and the baby fish says, well, I want to go to school. And its mother says, well, you can't go to school. Why not? Well, the school's on land, and you're a fish. And the baby fish is left to ponder this situation and say, this is ridiculous.
This is
I
so
deserve
unfair
to go to school. And this is, of course, a book at its heart that is a metaphor about exclusion. But at Room to Read, I'm very happy to say even the teenage authors understand our philosophy of GSD, which is get stuff done. Don't sit around talking about the problem, figure out a solution. So in the book, the animals go, they buy a fish bowl, they scoop baby fish up, they do a little happy parade, and they plunk baby fish down next to the chalkboard. Voila, baby fish goes to school. That's just one of the 1,000 titles that we are working to create that I think bring these lessons alive for the kids who read them.
Why do you focus on girls' education?
Well, the challenge is that in the developing world, there are over 200 million children who woke up this morning and did not go to school. I'll repeat that number. It's shocking, 200 million. There are 800 million people in the developing world who are illiterate, and two-thirds of those, both those groups, are girls and women. And as we all know, when women get educated, things change because an educated mother can pass on knowledge to the next generation, but also educated women have healthier families. So at Room to Read, our goal is to help boys and to help girls. We're not anti-boy. As a former boy myself, I would never want to be accused of being anti-boy. When we open schools and open libraries, they're open to both genders. But quite often what happens is a disproportionate number of boys are showing up. The girls risk being left behind because if the parents can afford to send only one child to school, they'll send the eldest son. So Room to Read has a program called the Girls Education Program. Over 20,000 girls wake up every day and go to school with our support, and we've guaranteed them we'll keep them in the program through the end of secondary school as long as they pass from one grade to the next. And every year, 96 to 97% of our girls pass, which is pretty amazing because if you're born poor, female, in a rural village, in a really poor country, to illiterate parents, you have 5 strikes against you. The world expects these girls to not succeed. These girls have different intentions. They intend to succeed and to graduate.
You know, John, I wonder about the curriculum because all these schools are still under the Ministry of Education.
Yes.
Do you have any say in what the curriculum is? Because what if the curriculum is teaching intolerance? I mean, a madrasa is a school.
Well, if the country has a curriculum that we don't believe is a good curriculum, we're simply not going to go into that country. Because changing a nation's curriculum is probably something that's above my pay grade. It's not an easy thing to do. But what we actually find is that when we survey the world to look at where are good things happening, where are things moving in the right direction, there's actually more countries that we'd like to be into than we have the funding. So that's one of the reasons I spend a lot of time writing books and being out public speaking to remind people no money equals no mission. We have to be good at fundraising to get to more kids in more places. And every day we lose is a day we don't get back. That's what kills me, is to think about all those 200 million kids who woke up this morning and did not go to school.
You know, as you know, that there are some cultures in Islamist countries that not only are don't encourage or value girls' education, but they are actively against it. Mm-hmm. And a few years ago, there was an attack in Afghanistan by 2 men on a motorbike. They threw acid in the faces of 12 little Afghan girls who were on their way to school. Mm. You wrote a letter in your journal in response to that attack, and I wonder if you could read it for us.
Sure, yeah, I would love to. This letter was, really a letter in my journal that I wrote to get my thoughts together. And the reason I wrote this at the time I wrote it was that those acid attacks happened very close in time to the actual meltdown of the global financial system. And we were facing extraordinary pressure at Room to Read to reduce our number of girls in our program and to delay the launch of the program in Bangladesh. And for me, reading about those acid attacks, it made me realize these are not just numbers, these are lives. And if these other forces are saying girls should not be in school, Room to Read has to be a positive force that says more girls go to school. So on the day that I read about those acid attacks, I wrote a letter to declare my intentions that Room to Read would not stop growing. And I'm proud to say that since this letter was written, we've doubled the number of girls in our program from 10,000 to over 20,000. So I don't start the letter off very elegantly. It starts off with the words, "Dear bastards." That's probably fair to say what they were. "Dear bastards, I read about your cowardly act. Do you really want to keep alive a set of beliefs that come straight out of the 8th century and do so in a barbaric way? You want to tell little girls that they don't belong in school? Well, guess what? Our team is going to engage you in battle on this issue. We are going to send the exact opposite message, and we plan to use a much louder megaphone. With every fiber of my being, I vow that Room to Read will embrace young girls around the world. We will tell them that we believe in them, that we will support them, and that they belong in school and they will stay in school. We will not do this just today or this year, but every single day until that glorious moment when they become the first member of their family to complete secondary school. Inaction in the face of tyranny is cowardice. Reading about your despicable acts convinces me to oppose you. One of the most immutable laws of physics is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction." Looking up, I stopped talking to the bad guys and stopped writing in my journal. I had reached a point of clarity, and I made a simple vow to myself. Financial crisis or no crisis, Whether donors are flaky or not, Room to Read will stick with our 2009 growth plan. We were delaying the launch of our girls' education program in Bangladesh, but no, it will be given the green light to launch with our first 200 girls. The team in Zambia will be told it can triple the number of girls from 200 to 600. The program in India, in which Muslim girls are a primary focus, will stick with its plans and add more than 1,000 girls. Worldwide, we will grow the program from 7,000 girls to more than 10,000. And I'm proud to say that since that letter was written, we not only grew from 7,000 to 10,000, but today over 20,000 girls are in the program.
That's John Wood reading from his book, Creating Room to Read, A Story of Hope in the Battle for Global Literacy. You are not operating in Afghanistan or in Pakistan.
We are not, no.
It's just not safe.
I think that if you look at the issues of political stability and social stability, it's really hard to get much done, and it doesn't mean that our hearts don't go out to the kids in those places. I want one day for Room to Read to be everywhere, that children need us. The challenge, I think, is that there's just so much need all over the world. 800 million illiterate people, there's just a lot. And so what I hope is that Room to Read is one part of a big movement around the world. We know now that with the focus, the attention on Malala, there's a lot more people who are paying attention to this issue of girls' education.
This is the young woman that was shot by the Taliban for promoting girls' education.
Quote unquote, daring to promote girls' education. We know that Gordon Brown now, the former UK Prime Minister, or Great Britain Prime Minister, is now leading an education initiative at the UN called Education First. There's a lot of momentum around this issue of saying without education, nothing really changes. So Room to Read aims to be one of the leaders of a global movement that says every child deserves a school, every child deserves great teachers, every child deserves to be literate, every child deserves books, and every child deserves to go to school alongside her younger and older brothers.
But you also do not fund girl-only schools.
No, I'm a very firm believer, as is our team, in the fact that if boys and girls go to school side by side, with that you get a lot of understanding. And I can tell you from my own experience, nobody could ever tell me that girls and women were dumb or inferior, because I sat beside girls in school and watched them outperform me academically, right? And I think that once you realize that girls can kind of kick your butt academically, it's really hard for a guy to be told that women are not smart enough or that women do not deserve the chance to get educated. And I think the world would be a much better place if boys and girls went to school side by side as opposed to being separated. Because once you're separated, you can believe the stereotypes people tell about you.
So even segregating women or girls and boys in the classroom itself, you're not in favor of that?
No, I'm not. I mean, I think that we do have to understand local conditions in some heavily Muslim areas of India. We've worked really hard because not a single girl made it past 8th grade. But the reason for that was they didn't have any female teachers in those schools. So by lobbying the local Ministry of Education, we were able to then say, let's now get female teachers in the schools. Once that happened, the uptick of girls going to 8th and 9th grade was literally measured not in the dozens, it was measured in the hundreds. And that was just one small change.
There's a great story in the book about Literacy One. I wonder if you can just briefly tell us what that is.
Literacy One was a little publicity stunt we did. When you're a small NGO, you have to be scrappy and you have to find ways to get people to pay attention to you. And
entrepreneurial.
Entrepreneurial. And so we have a great relationship with Cathay Pacific Airlines, the Hong Kong-based carrier. And one day, brainstorming with their chief financial officer, he said that they were doing these delivery flights of new Boeing 777, the 777 jets. And would we like to make use of one of the delivery flights from Boeing Field in Seattle over to Asia? So we decided
they're typically empty when they're just being delivered over.
Exactly. And so we said, why should it be empty? We can fill it with books. And this was in honor of Room to Read's 5,000th library. We did this flight. We called it Literacy One, after Air Force One, of course. We approached our friends at Scholastic, and they donated 400,000 books to fill this cavernous cargo hold that these 777s had. And then we had the pleasure of putting on not only our largest donors as passengers on this kind of money can't buy, one-of-a-kind experience, being the only passengers on a 777, but also my parents got to hitchhike along, which was really, for me, as we recognized that milestone, a wonderful way to thank my parents for all they had done, including believing in me when a lot of people in the world were telling me I was crazy to leave Microsoft to do this.
Tell me, John, what impact all this has had. I mean, I know that, the numbers are huge. There's so many kids in school, so many kids reading, loving to read. Mm-hmm. But as far as impact on their communities, are you able to measure that now, or do we have to wait a generation to see changes?
No, I think we can measure some of it now. I mean, we're very fortunate at Room to Read that we have a great relationship with the Gates Foundation, and they fund a lot of our evaluations. It's the old Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. We trust that what we're doing is working, but we really want to verify it. So we hire outside evaluators to go and check out the facilities on an unannounced basis. So they show up without telegraphing that they're arriving, and then they basically survey to see what's going on. So some of our numbers for quality, 98% of our libraries now have checkout systems in place. To date, over 10 million books have been checked out of our libraries because we really think that when a child takes a book home, quite often that not only do they read at night and it extends the learning day, but they also read to their siblings. And so you get a lot of intergenerational reading happening. As I mentioned, 96% of our girls who are in our program pass to the next grade from year to year. And last year we did a survey that showed that over 60% of the girls who have finished secondary school are now moving on to university and tertiary education. And that's finding their own way. We're not able to pay for that. And so I think that's really how a middle class starts to develop. If you start to have students not only finish secondary school, but then move on from there to become nurses, rural healthcare workers, accountants, whatever it might be, that's how a middle class, I think, begins to form.
What do you have in store for the next 10 years for Room to Read?
I hope a lot of growth. And I hope that, in the next 10 years, my goal would be that we reach at least, 10 to 15 million additional children. We've reached 7.5 million children to date, and that really has been as a kind of a bootstrapped organization that was just getting off the ground. So my hope would be that in, 10 years down the road, we might have reached 20 or 25 million children. Obviously, it's not just the number. They have to be reached with quality, and that's why it's so important that we work to do professional development for teachers. It's really important that we continue to monitor and evaluate our work. But I really don't want to slow down. My hope is that I will be doing this work the day I die, and I hope that there's hundreds of other people who are involved in Room to Read. It's not just me, but who are going to take a 10 or 20 or 30-year run at this. And if we do, the old quote from Archimedes about give me a lever long enough and I can move the earth. I really feel that's what education is, and I think that's what Room to Read is on to, is just give us that lever and give us 30 years, and we're going to accomplish great things.
That's John Wood. He's author of Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, founder and co-chair of Room to Read. His latest book is Creating Room to Read, A Story of Hope in the Battle for Global Literacy. It's published by Viking. John, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you. It's been a fun interview, and I appreciate your time.